Good evening and welcome to Biden Headlines, and in this programme today we'll be marking the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Kursk, known as the biggest tank battle in history, where Hitler launched his final offensive known as a blitzkrieg against the Soviet Red Army around the Russian city of Kursk. Regan, it's great to be doing this programme, particularly as this is the first of our pre-recorded programmes for the summer break, and I thought that very significant to mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Kursk, primarily because this was a crucial battle that effectively meant the beginning of the end of Hitler's reign and occupation of terror and evil over Europe. But this is also a narrative and a story that is rarely told, either by the British or the Americans, but plays a huge part in kind of the Russian history and Russian psyche.
Absolutely, Simon. It's great to join you as well. We're going to be remembering this 80th anniversary primarily to introduce it to our viewers because you may not have even heard of this battle previously. It's, as you said, Simon, it's not very regularly covered in regard to anniversaries, but 80 years should be back in our minds once more, I think. The Battle of Kursk occurred in the Russian city of Kursk, the west of the country, and occurred on July 5th and ended on the 23rd of August, 1943. It was a military operation by the Nazis and was Hitler's response to the devastating defeat by the Soviet Red Army at the Battle of Stalingrad, which is more commonly remembered and known. It was a particularly brutal, bloody battle. This Battle, though, of the Kursk was the last chance for Nazi Germany to try and regain dominance on the Eastern Front during World War II, and would be also their final blitzkrieg offensive. They were beginning to see their power wane and were beginning to be put on the back foot by the Allied forces. Hitler planned a massive assault on the Soviets using heavy tanks, artillery, and air power with an attempt to destroy the Soviet Red Army. It would be, however, the Soviet Red Army that would push back the Nazi advance on the Eastern Front, eventually leading to the total collapse of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1945.
Yeah, so let's put this in a bit of its historical context regarding the Second World War and events. So this has all happened before when the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941 to invade the Soviet Union and then to conquer them. The concept of this one was that Hitler wanted living space so that the German Empire could expand, and plus he also wanted some of the rich resources that we now know are in Ukraine, such as the crops, the oil, and also the grain as well, because we know that pretty much the Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe. So this was crucial in Hitler's thinking. Hitler believed that Operation Barbarossa would be over swiftly, as he used the same blitzkrieg tactics that he used for the invasion of Western Europe in May and June of 1940. Germany did not anticipate the protracted campaign continuing into the formidable Russian winter. Clothes for winter had not been supplied to German troops. Arrangements for vehicles and lubricants to function in the freezing temperatures were not made. And Hitler ordered his generals to seize the Western Russia and the Ukraine. However, Hitler's and his advisors underestimated the industrial and military might that Russia would build in 10 years in the signing of the peace pact between Hitler and Stalin in the build-up to the Second World War. They underestimated Russia's insurmountable assets, vast terrain that sucked in invaders until the defenders pursued the invaders, and the paralyzing winters. Hitler had forgot of Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia, and he had also entirely misjudged the resolve of the Russian people. They would not fight for communism, they would fight for their motherland. So began the invasion of Russia. a struggle that Russians called the Great Patriotic War. It demanded patriotism and sacrifice beyond human endurance. And on Sunday, the 22nd of June 1941, some 4 million soldiers of Germany and our allies, belonging to the Axis powers, attacked the Soviet Union along its 1,800-mile frontier. Never in human history have we witnessed the deployment of such a massive force against another country. The invasion was supported by 600,000 armed vehicles and some 700,000 horses.
Operation Barbarossa represented the largest invasion force of the war, representing some 80% of the Wehrmacht, and on what was the most powerful invasion force in history. The numbers are staggering. 4 million across an 1,800-mile stretch is just...
Can't imagine it.
Yeah, we've not seen it before and we've not seen it since. The German invasion caught the Red Army unprepared with a three-pronged attack that was headed toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine in the south. German panzer divisions and the Luftwaffe helped Germany gain an early advantage against the numerous but poorly trained Soviet troops. On the first day of the attack alone, the Luftwaffe managed to shoot down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft. German forces initially moved quickly along the vast front, taking millions of Soviet soldiers as prisoners. The Einsatzgruppen, or armed SS death squads, followed in the army's wake, seeking out and killing many civilians, especially Soviet Jews, which were numerous. Hitler's directives for the invasion included the Commissar Order, which authorized the immediate execution of all captured enemy officers. There were many Soviet prisoners of war. They were killed immediately upon capture, another practice that violated international war protocols. In early October, Hitler ordered the launch of Operation Typhoon, the German offensive against Moscow. The delay had given the Soviets time to strengthen the defense of their capital with some 1 million troops and 1,000 new T-34 tanks. After a successful initial assault, the muddy roads of autumn, known as Rasputitsa, or quagmire season, literally stalled the German offensive outside Moscow, where they ran into the improved Russian defenses. The siege of Leningrad was one of the aims of Operation Barbarossa, and this is another element, another battle siege is what it's practically
which is St. Petersburg today.
It's just horrific in its toll. Heavy artillery shelling on the city beginning on the 1st of September of 1941. All roads to the city were blocked so that fuel and food supplies could not reach the people. And the German Luftwaffe dropped leaflets warning Leningrad citizens of impending starvation. Hitler and his generals expected Leningrad to, quote, drop like a leaf, end quote. Never in the history of mankind, Simon, had such onslaught, though, been met with such resistance. Food supplies stopped. Germans bombed power stations, so there was no electricity and heating. Dwindling food stocks were unable to be replenished. Rationing was unsuccessful. People brewed broth of leaves and seaweed, ate grease from machinery, and then eventually cats and dogs. It's estimated that about 1 million people died of starvation during the siege of Leningrad. Again, just thinking of the figures of that, beyond anything that we see or have heard of even in modern warfare, as bad as that can be. 1 million people dying of starvation is an incredible travesty. Never in modern history had an enemy laid siege to a city to starve its citizens and quell them into submission. Those who lived through those 900-odd days could never banish the horrific images of starvation and death. Stalin also showed incredible callousness by not lifting the siege because he wanted the full power of the Red Army to concentrate on Stalingrad, the city that bore his name.
Yeah. So on to the Battle of Stalingrad that happened in 1942. So according to history.com, by June 1940, Hitler had advanced into the Soviet Union and hoped to easily take the strategic city of Stalingrad, the namesake of the Soviet leader at the time, Joseph Stalin. But Stalin rallied both Russian troops and civilians who dug in and vowed to fight to the very end. And when the German Sixth Army reached Stalingrad in September, they were unprepared for the well-armed and well-trained Soviet Red Army. Ferocious fighting ensued as the Germans fought their way through the city, building by building, house by house, and were met with heavy resistance. The carnage was horrific on both sides. And there's that really good film that came out about 2000 regarding this particular battle. I think it was called Stalingrad. It was all about a German Nazi sniper and a Soviet sniper, and it tells that incredible story. I also see that by mid-November, the Germans found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, extremely low on food and medical supplies, and were surrounded by Russians. They saw that the writing was on the wall and had a chance to escape, but Hitler commanded that they hold their position to the last man and the last round. He also promised additional provisions that never actually arrived. The Germans were unprepared for Russia's brutal winter and suffered in freezing temperatures. They suffered from starvation and disease. This left little choice. The German general, Friedrich Paulus, went against Hitler's direct orders when he surrendered his weakened troops to Russia on the 2nd of February 1943, an act which Hitler later called an act of treason. Germany's defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad was a pivotal point in the war. It pushed the Germans back to southern Russia and left them weak and on the defensive. It also showed the world that the Nazi army was not invincible. Deeply humiliated Hitler, who planned a response of a massive counterattack to permanently solve the Soviet problem.
And that leads us into discussion of Operation Citadel, which was in July of 1943, with the Wehrmacht, the German army, weakened by the loss of so many men and equipment in the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler then still mobilized 3 million troops, wanting to revenge the heavy loss of that battle. Operation Citadel, the German offensive to destroy the Red Army at the Russian city of Kursk, proceeded, and Hitler said of this operation, "We shine like a beacon around the world." A bit of a weird, bizarre thing to say, but of course he was seeking to try and galvanize fading support, I'm sure, and trying to commission and recruit more soldiers, doubtless, as well. The losses were catastrophic at Stalingrad. So
I think he's also taking into calculations that by this time the Americans had kind of entered the war. Knowing that it wasn't just Britain on its own now in an island and the Commonwealth pretty much fighting against Hitler's forces. He had already lost the Battle of North Africa, so British oil reserves were secure. The Suez Canal was secure, and the passage to the east and India. And with more and more American troops and heavy weaponry coming into Europe, he knew that the biggest battle was going to happen in the West. So he effectively wanted one final blow to take out the Soviet Red Army, so that he wasn't dealing with a kind of three-front war. One on the eastern front, together on the western front with, as we saw with the landing invasion of D-Day in June of 1944, which would happen a year later. But also then we also see that the Allies were ready to and started to invade Italy to land in Sicily. So the liberation of Europe began of Nazi tyranny. So this was all part of, I think, Hitler's strategic thinking as well.
The main objective of Operation Citadel was for the Nazis to destroy 5 Soviet armies and prevent Stalin from launching any more military offensives against the Wehrmacht through 1943. It would allow Hitler to deploy more of his forces to the Mediterranean theater of war to confront the Allies who were there. But Hitler also needed to prove to his allies, the Axis powers, and to the world that Germany was still a formidable enemy and that Germany had control of the Eastern Front. He also wanted the tactical advantage that controlling the Kursk's railways and roads would provide. There was no real strategic significance to the Kursk other than that it was at the center of this disputed area, and a year's worth of fighting had created a massive salient, outward protruding bulge of land on the battle line. Approximately it was 150 miles from north to south and 100 miles from east to west, so quite significant. Salient. At the center of the salient lay the Russian city of Kursk. The salient became known as the Kursk Bulge and was a strategic location for Germany. By 1943, Germany's invasion of Russia, the Battle of Stalingrad, and other engagements had weakened Hitler's army by almost 2 million men. Desperate to fill the void, he recruited World War I veterans up to age 50 and young men from the Hitler Youth Program previously exempt from serving on the front line. So we started by seeing that his Operation Barbarossa had 4 million invade Russia, right? But now he's been diminished by about 2 million. He's lost half of his fighting troop on that front, and so he's desperate to galvanize. He's desperate to finally seal some sort of meaningful victory and strategic advantage over the Soviets, and resorts to recruiting Hitler Youth. You know, some of these probably would have been children.
Which is an act of desperation. And also, I think, you know, if we look back 80 years ago, any German soldier in the Wehrmacht would actually be dreading being posted to the Eastern Front. We know that many officers who probably disobeyed some of Hitler's orders as well were forced to go to the Eastern Front. So the Eastern Front was where, if you were a German soldier during the Second World War, this is where you did not want to be deployed. And the fact that then Hitler started to call up those that had been retired, who are near 50, to come and fight as well, kind of smacked of desperation, and also the Hitler Youth as well. So literally we're seeing then the deployment here for the first time of kind of teenagers into the most fierce fighting that the Germans would do in the Second World War against the Soviet Red Army as well. And we also see the incredible kind of willpower of the Russians. The Russians, as we described the battle and the siege of Leningrad, the siege of Stalingrad, you know, the Russians showed incredible resilience against the Nazi invasion, enough that were able to galvanize the nation and to kind of propel back the Nazi invaders. Is an incredible feat, particularly as we look back 80 years ago.
In March of 1943, after crushing Russian resistance in Belgorod and Kharkov, near the south of the Kursk Bulge, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein wanted to take advantage of the momentum and the battle-weary Russian army and attempt to seize Kursk. But the Wehrmacht, Germany's unified military forces, chose to prepare for a later campaign along the Kursk Bulge instead, so they then lost their potential edge.
Yeah, and I just want to add something in here, because this is kind of very important. And if we compare what's going on now with Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, and also the way that Hitler conducted the war, in many cases in the same way that Putin is in charge of the operations. He's not referring or listening to the advice of his generals. He thinks that he knows better than his military generals, so therefore he's taking full control. And this explains why, for example, in the Ukraine, it's becoming to be such a mess for the Russian army. In the same way, this is what Hitler did. He didn't actually listen to his generals, who knew more about kind of military tactics. They knew more about what they were facing regarding the Soviet army, and he kind of thought that he knew best. So we see that Hitler's own arrogance, his own pride, actually got the better of him. And if he'd actually listened to some of his generals in the field, he would then have been much better prepared, and the likelihood they could have taken the Russian city of Kursk by surprise when they had momentum. And war is all about momentum. Once you have that momentum, it carries you forward to meet your kind of military and strategic objectives. This is something that I don't think Hitler understood because of the kind of micromanagement that he had over his own generals, and he thought that he was almost the kind of Messiah incarnate, and so therefore no one could tell Hitler what was happening or what Hitler should do. So again, we see incredible miscalculations on behalf of Hitler. No doubt the prayers and intercessions when people were praying actually confused Hitler in his decision making, and this is one fatal mistake that he made.
Over the next few months after that refusal, after that ignoring essentially the advice that he was being given, and the Wehrmacht's refusal to essentially take the Kursk on that initial moment when they would have had the edge, Germany did amass over 570,000 men, 10,000 guns and mortars, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,500 aircraft to mount an attack on the Kursk Bulge and take Kursk. But the Soviets, this is part of the issue, you know, there was probably thinking, well, okay, we'll build up, we'll amass more troops, and then we'll take the Kursk. But that's also giving these battle-weary Soviet soldiers opportunity and time to recuperate and rest. They're not just sitting still, they're also going to be developing and doing things.
And I think the speed and the production, is it the kind of, is it called the Russian T-tanks?
Yeah.
That were produced on a massive scale. I mean, the speed and the production that the Soviets went into production in producing these lightweight, fast tanks that they used were colossal. So we also see that the Soviets were able to produce more tanks, more aircraft, more weapons than the Nazis as well, which would then give them a kind of advantage going into the Battle of the Kursk.
And with every delay on Hitler's side, the Soviets were given more time to prepare as well, and so they eventually deployed 1,300,000 soldiers. It's over 20,000 guns and mortars, 3,600 tanks, 2,650 aircraft, and 5 reserve field armies of another 500,000 men and 1,500 additional tanks, protected by more than 6,000 miles of trenches and interspersed with around 2,400 anti-tank and 2,700 anti-personnel mines. The north of the Kursk Bulge was Germany's 9th Army, made up of 3 panzer divisions and over 300,000 men. At the south was their 4th Panzer Army, also with over 300,000 men, and a combination of Panther and Tiger tanks. To the west was Germany's 2nd Army with around 110,000 men.
Yeah, it's incredible as well. And we also see that south was the famous Nazi 4th Panzer Army, together with 300,000 men, as you just mentioned, and also the newly produced Tiger tanks, which were very, very effective, very fast movable tanks that were coming off the production line in Germany. Hitler actually delayed Operation Citadel, as he's known, because he was hoping for what's known as the Blitzkrieg shock campaign. Now, we have done various programs to mark the Nazi invasion of Western Europe in May and June of 1940. We've covered Dunkirk on this program, and so Blitzkrieg was the military tactics deployed by the German Wehrmacht in its war during the Second World War. So what they would do is they would use their infantry soldiers, they would use their tanks at high speed, backed up by military aircraft in incredible speed to take over countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And this is all what we know about the evacuation of Dunkirk and why the British Expeditionary Force was actually cut off, and the speed of the Nazi advance was known as the Blitzkrieg. So Hitler wanted to try and attempt to carry out another Blitzkrieg using shock campaigns that concentrated firepower in narrow areas and confused and cut down the enemy, as he had done in May and June of 1940. They planned the Blitzkrieg attacks on the north and south of the Kursk bulge, and then intended to meet the Kursk in the middle of the salient. Despite warnings from some of his generals to abandon Operation Citadel due to the Red Army's substantial fortifications, Hitler was determined to move forward, but not right away. The original start date for the Battle of Kursk was May the 3rd, 1943, but Hitler chose to wait for better weather conditions and the delivery of the new state-of-the-art Panther and Tiger tanks, even though they'd never actually been tested in the field. Russia took full advantage of this delay by bolstering its defensive zones around the Kursk, which included tank traps, barbed wire, snares, and nearly 1 million anti-tank personnel and anti-tank mines. With the help of Kursk civilians, they also dug a vast network of trenches extending to at least 2,500 miles, and you can just begin to imagine the scale of this. We also see that a successful Blitzkrieg depends on the element of surprise, and by the time the Germans were ready to launch Operation Citadel, they'd lost that advantage. To make matters worse, British intelligence had cracked the infamous German Wehrmacht secret code and was regularly passing on intelligence to the Soviets. The Soviets knew the Germans were coming, had had ample time to prepare.
Now, the offensive would begin on the early hours of July 5th, 1943. Among the beautiful yellow wheat fields that surrounded the Kursk bulge, Operation Citadel launched. The German forces moved steadily for 4 days before they encountered strong resistance from the Soviets. The Germans unleashed their own artillery assault on the northern and southern parts of the salient, followed by infantry strikes on the ground supported by the Luftwaffe. Later that morning, the Soviets' Air Force attacked German airfields, but they were unsuccessful. Still, the Red Army's ground defenses prevented German tanks from making much headway in the north and penetrating the heavily armored salient. By July 10th, the Soviets had halted the Ninth Army's northern advance. On the 10th of July, Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Sicily, forcing Hitler to abandon the military operation and redirect his panzer divisions to Italy to prevent additional Allied landings. So a massive catastrophe. You can think strategically. Surely Hitler would have known, surely Hitler would have been advised of coming issues, of coming potential invasions by the Allies on Italy as well. He had been advised months before to go ahead and take the Kursk. They had not done that. They had added some troops, but they lost the element of the Blitzkrieg. You can't have a Blitzkrieg unless you have that element of surprise. That's what it was all about. There was no surprise going on here. The Soviets had ample time to prepare a massive army which was able to meet this sham Blitzkrieg and defeat it rather swiftly.
And also, I think we have to also mention the famous Enigma code, because this played a major role here in providing the intelligence by cracking the German codes. The Enigma team were able to then work out the intelligence of what was happening in terms of the Soviets, in terms of the Battle of the Kursk. So this also then helped, for example, then to pass on that vital intelligence information to the Soviets, and that they could be prepared for that battle, which was crucial.
Now, the battle for Kursk involved the biggest tank battle in history. That's the significance of it. That's why it's worthy of remembering. Previously, we had seen so many individual personnel on the front, and indeed the original operation that we were speaking of just at the beginning with 4 million individual troops. That was very, very significant. But here we have the largest use of mechanical products for war, essentially. At any time, and so.
And on screen here, these are the Russian tanks known as the T-tanks that were to be deployed in the Battle of the Kursk against German forces. And of course, then we got B-roll there of this is the German army involved in that battle. I mean, I think also, I mean, can you imagine the scale of the battle of this is incredible. I mean, like a total of 6,000 tanks were deployed to fight the Germans, and this was the biggest tank battle in the world has ever seen or the world has ever known. To be on the kind of those front lines must have been absolutely horrific, whether you're a Soviet from the Red Army, I think. But I think what motivated the Red Army in particular was their kind of hatred of the Germans and what the Nazis had done at the invasion of Russia, the siege of Leningrad, the siege of Stalingrad. They saw starvation of their families. They saw how the Nazis treated them, and also knew that the Russians, that the Nazis considered them kind of inferior, racially inferior. And so therefore this would be easy for the mighty so-called Nazi Aryans to take over. So I mean, this was an important role as well, because also with this battle as well, we also see that, for example, the Ukraine and Russia was where these huge, large Jewish populations were as well. So this also hindered the SS's ability to round up Jews belonging to the Soviet Union. And we can see then in these incredibly straight fields known for their kind of wheat and barley where this battle took place 80 years ago. And it's extraordinary, isn't it, that we see the greatest tank battle in history, and yet I don't know of any films known as the battle for the Kursk.
No,
I don't know many documentaries apart from a few on YouTube that have been produced on this battle. And this was one of the biggest, if not the biggest battle to take place during the entire Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, what scenes we have there just from that footage that we've been watching, and you can see to a degree the speed and the ease of maneuverability of those Russian T-tanks compared particularly with the previous tanks that were being used and were still being used across Germany and by Allied forces. Other Allied forces as well. So there was a greater speed. They were able to use these and deploy these in the Kursk battle. 6,000 tanks were deployed in that fight. The Germans would lose 3,000 tanks. 4,000 aircraft also took part in this battle. Just thinking through 4,000 aircraft, what that must look like. There you have that, just a whole front line of tanks. Yeah, nothing's seen like that before or since. 4,000 aircraft, Germans lost 1,400 in battle. The human toll was absolutely catastrophic. And we take this into account. We already considered it started in the early morning hours of July 5th, 1943. Okay, and it was essentially over by the 10th of July. So we have 5 days, and there was a loss believed to be of about 200,000 German casualties, some 800,000 Soviets. Absolute catastrophic loss of life just from this one battle. I mean, Simon, a lot of the more recent conflicts and elements of modern warfare have seen years go by without approaching those figures.
No, we haven't seen these figures
for whole conflicts
in recent times. Yeah, there's no modern conflict, I think, that would actually see the deployment.
This is just one battle
Of 6,000 tanks, casualties of 200,000 German soldiers and some 800 Soviets. But I mean, this was a numbers game as well, because the Soviets could deploy more troops, more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery. So, and also they knew the territory much better than the Germans did as well, because
they were less trained, though.
Well, yeah, you could say that the German forces were, of course, better trained, better experience in kind of Western Europe with the invasions of Belgium and France and the Netherlands, and then of course Greece, going down all the way down to the south of Europe as well. Invasion of Poland as well as other Eastern European states. So the Germans had greater experience. Their fighters were more battle hardened, but also I think you also have to understand as well that the Germans have been involved in pretty much fighting since September of 1939. So we're looking at almost kind of three and a half years of fighting, nearly 4 years of fighting they've already been involved in. They're also very much involved in helping, in the Spanish Civil War to help the Spanish president, Franco, as well, with the fascists as well. So they're very much involved in that battle as well. So you can actually see that maybe after all these years of fighting that the Germans had become a bit war-weary of what was going on. And, it was just Hitler's sheer determination to take out and take control of the Eastern Front so that he could then concentrate all his efforts on pushing back the Allied advance as well. Would have played a major role, but the scale, I don't think we can possibly comprehend the scale of this battle.
And the disparity between the 200,000 German casualties versus 800,000 Soviet casualties. What you're seeing there is, I think anyway, just my commentary on it is probably that disparity in training as well, experience also, even though the Soviets were essentially on ground that they were more familiar with themselves, they were less skilled. And their technique, their tactic seems to have been primarily to overwhelm the German force with vast numbers. And they eventually did succeed. And that's what happens on the 3rd of August. The Red Army attacks Kursk and overwhelms the German soldiers, and they're now on the run, with Hitler ignoring pleas for reinforcements and ordering the creation of a fortified line, the East Wall. And that was done not to allow his forces a place to fall back and hold, rather than to prevent a retreat. Germany never would regain momentum on the Eastern Front or recover their loss of manpower and armor, with Hitler and his Wehrmacht soon becoming reactive instead of proactive, while they found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts. So one of the things that stands out repeatedly throughout history, Simon, is that evil always overextends itself. It spreads itself so thin, it becomes proud and haughty, and thinks that it can gain full dominion and power over territory that truly is not it. And so you have an evil force that is essentially, I mean, you can look at it, Germany is trying to rally around all of the Axis, right? And it's spreading itself to support what we see going on in Italy, what we see going on in Spain. It had tried to conquer North Africa as well. But we do eventually see Japan over in the Far East enter a completely different arena of war, and so all of these different powers. But to be fair, if you look at the whole of the Axis powers in Europe, Germany was pulling more than its fair share of weight, if we can call it that. It was trying to hold this not particularly powerful axis together, in the sense that Italy's power was waning. It couldn't hold its own. Spain couldn't hold its own.
But Italy wasn't a good. I mean, Spain was neutral during the Second World War.
Right.
Italy, for example, under Mussolini, said, "Yeah, we'll support," but they were not very effective in fighting. This is why the Germans had to take over whenever the Italians were involved. I think there was that famous expression that Italian tanks only had 4 gears, 1 going forward and 3 in reverse, which is a kind of reflection a little bit of the kind of Italian fighting spirit. They didn't want to fight.
Right.
They wanted to party. They didn't want to fight. So they weren't known for that. And I think Mussolini reluctantly went along with Hitler as part of the Axis powers. But also we see then that Hitler involved, for example, Austria, and the Austrians made up so much part of the leadership of the Nazis, pretty much the SS as well were many leading Nazis. So Austria played a major role in this, and of course then when they took over countries like Czechoslovakia and the other countries like in the Baltic states,
right,
they would actually recruit locals to actually join the German army as well.
And in Ukraine, they were successful to some degree. They, the slaughter of Jews in Ukraine was with the complicity of many Ukrainians who joined in that, and the same. They would have repeated the same anywhere they went. And as you always find, there will be people who get caught up in the moment, who feel like, oh, there's no, if you can't beat them, join them. They've conquered anyway. We might as well, try and get some benefits out of this. And it was very much, Simon, a new world order that was on the horizon. And these individuals were looking at the potential of the Third Reich spreading across the entirety of Europe. Early adopters, early supporters of such a system might very well have better chances of rising in the ranks and gaining places of power that they previously would have found completely impossible to attain. I think that's often what we see in regards to what happened throughout World War II and even some of the horrors of the Holocaust. You had individuals who were probably, in many cases, clinically vulnerable, maybe psychotic or insane in some way, placed in charge of certain arenas, and the catastrophic war crimes that were committed therein are reflection to some degree of that lust for power, that lust for control, that hunger to attain notoriety and conquer, that hunger to have complete dominion over something. And so you see across these various fronts of Nazi Germany in its conflict and in its endeavors, very small microcosms of the bigger picture. So each individual in a place of control, happy, wanting to please their leader, their Führer, they would commit heinous acts to gain that favor.
No, absolutely. I think it's also important when we're reflecting on the Battle of the Kursk to realise what a huge strategic mistake it was to renegade on what was known as the Soviet-Nazi Pact of 1938. This is the agreement that Hitler made with Stalin, and that these two arch enemies would come together for peace. And it means that, for example, the Soviets could control and dominate Eastern Europe, whilst Hitler then was free to actually invade Poland, as he did on September the 1st, 1939. So this played, I think, a huge part in this one. But when we look at this strategically, it didn't make much sense to actually then invade the Soviet Union, because then you know that you're up against a multi-front war, and you can't win multi-front wars. And so therefore, if we look at the time of when Hitler then launched Operation Barbarossa, for example, in the summer of 1941, the Americans hadn't come into the war. Britain was on her own in Europe, pretty much alone against the Nazis. Most of the fighting in 1941 involving British troops took place across North Africa, and the Battle of Tobruk and Alamein, and that was where the most fierce fighting took place over Hitler wanting to control the oil reserves. So of course the major event then that changed everything was the Japanese kind of attack on Pearl Harbor in December 4th, wasn't it, 1941, which was the game changer. Right. And the kind of big question is, with the Axis powers, particularly, how close was Hitler to the Imperial Army of Japan? And did the Japanese then see the kind of ongoing Second World War as an opportunity to extend the Japanese empire? And how much did they actually cooperate with Hitler himself? Because I'm pretty sure that Hitler would not have advised the Japanese to attack the American US Navy stationed in Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And that was a game changer. And this is what really essentially led the beginning and the end. We see the kind of mobilization through the Battle of the Kursk of the Soviet army, combined with the introduction of the Americans in your nation with huge armaments, the B-17 flying bombers, to lead bombing campaigns into Germany to destroy the German industrial heartland. We see also during this time that the Allies now wanting to go on the offensive as they feel stronger. So we saw the first invasion on the forces of Sicily, to that big battle to actually climb up the boot of Italy, which was considered at the time to be Hitler's kind of Achilles heel. But in fact, that proved to be a very, very difficult battle as well. So, you know, you combine all these things and Hitler's starting to kind of lose that war, and which then leads to kind of D-Day in June 1944. And then we see the kind of pushback of German forces in Western Europe. So this is in memory of the American tank forces with their Sherman tanks, that together with the British and the Allied forces were able to push Germany back out of occupied France right into the German heartland to take the Nazis on in their own country, Germany.
We're speaking with Adam Makos, author of the book Spearhead. It's an exciting story about tank warfare in World War II. Adam, why should people care about wanting to read about some tank guys in World War II?
They led the way to victory, and a lot of times I always thought the paratroopers or the infantry guys were the first in front. But really, these men in the Spearhead division, that was their specialty, piercing through the enemy lines and driving down the enemy lines and winning these big battles. But with it, there was a big downside. They lost a lot of men, a lot of tanks. They paid a lot of sacrifices.
You concentrate on this one crew that has this guy Clarence as the guy who shoots off the guns all the time. And they were special in the fact that they got a tank that was better than all the others right towards the end of the war, right? That was an important part of how they managed to survive their battles.
We had the Sherman tank, and we thought it was the best tank ever. And then the Germans just kept getting bigger and better, and they were beating ours around. So as an emergency measure, we had to rush these 20 Pershing tanks to the European theater, and our hero Clarence got one of them. He was just a 21-year-old corporal from Coal Country, Pennsylvania. And now he's given the most advanced tank in the American arsenal, the only tank that can go toe-to-toe with the Germans. And with that comes a new responsibility. He has to lead the way in every attack since then.
Since one of his biggest motivations was surviving the war, that was always on his mind. So they got to Cologne, and it was important that they take the city of Cologne in Germany. And there was a tank, a Panzer tank, that was sort of waiting for them there, right? And they got into a one-on-one duel. And what was it about the American tank that ended up allowing them to survive the fact that the Germans could have shot the first shot?
The difference really was that man, Clarence Schmoyer, the gunner of the American tank. You see, he knew that he had to shoot first and shoot straight and not miss, because if he missed, somebody in his crew was going to die, and his crew was his family. He used to say, we're a family locked in a sardine can.
And wasn't it also a fact that the German guy in the tank, he thought because this was a new American tank, he thought it was maybe one of theirs. He wasn't sure that he was about to kill a German tank.
Clarence had an advantage that day. The German hesitated. A millisecond could be the difference in a battle like that. They say it was like a Western gunfight in the streets of Cologne.
And one of the saddest things is just before this one-on-one battle, a civilian car drove through, and both sides started to shoot at it, right? And what happened with that car?
They shot and they wounded, and then later she died. A civilian woman. Her name was Katerina Esser. She was just a grocery store clerk, but she was driving through the city trying to flee the city of Cologne.
And then that was on Clarence's mind for decades. And tell me how it finally ended, that with him and one of the Germans from that tank meeting in Cologne, and what did the Germans say to Clarence to give him peace finally about the way that woman died?
It stayed with Clarence for decades, and eventually he had to talk to somebody. Now his whole crew had all died by then. Who was left? Just the man he fought against. And so he traveled to Germany, and in front of the cathedral, he and Gustav Schaefer, the young German tank gunner who was back then was 18, who was battling him, they put their arms around each other, and Clarence said, "The war is over, we can be friends now." Gustav said, "Here's where my tank was, here's where Clarence's tank was." And these men said, "This is where the mistake happened." And Gustav said those beautiful words that would later give Clarence peace. He said, "Clarence, it's war. It's in the nature of it. It can't be undone. War was what was responsible. War was what took her life."
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for telling us about it. This has been Adam Makos we've been speaking to, author of the book Spearhead, a New York Times bestseller. Thank you very much, Adam.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and it's just a reminder, Simon, about the power of reconciliation. War features people on both sides who are going to be caught up in the mess of it, who don't want to be there. Most soldiers on the front line will have a cause that they will be fighting for to some degree, rightly or wrongly, blinded sometimes by patriotism or misplaced zeal and trust in propaganda. There is just war, and we have to be very, very clear on that. And of all the wars we can see in World War II, while there's in other wars sometimes you can talk about complexities and whatnot, we have a very clear-cut case for just war.
Absolutely.
In World War II. At the same time, after peace is declared, to be able to see some of those stories of reconciliation like that is very powerful.
No, absolutely. And for Christians who say that we watching this program that we're warmongers, it's not the truth, because sometimes in history you have to go to war in order to preserve the peace.
Yeah.
You have to go to war in order to protect your family, to protect your society, to protect your nation, to protect them was Christian civilization, and this is what Hitler spoke of when the Germans launched what was known as Operation Sea Lion to take out the RAF, for example, and battle of Britain. He said this is the battle for Christian civilization, and of course, sadly today we have moved so far away from our Christian civilization. But 80 years ago, this is what the West was fighting for. This is what the United States was fighting for. This is what Britain was fighting for, and the Commonwealth was fighting for. And there was no other way around it. If you wanted to maintain your Christian freedoms, you had to fight, and you had to take a gun, and you had to be deployed in various different theatres of the world in order to bring kind of peace, in order to protect the values that we have today. Because Hitler wanted to create a new religion in Germany. He did with involving the occult. He wanted Germany to go back to its kind of pagan roots. He wanted to take Christ out of Christmas. So, if the Nazis had won and Hitler had won, do you think that Christians would be free to go to church and worship God in churches across Nazi-occupied Europe? No, because as soon as he declared war on the Jews, he would have then declared war on the Christians as well.
And in some ways you can say that Hitler had already declared a kind of proxy war against Christians that was being successful. I mean, when you take out the truth of who God is, and you take out the truth of Christ's teaching and its application in day-to-day life, and that has catastrophic impact. And across Germany, tragically, people were embracing Hitler to some degree, in some cases, some extreme cases, as potentially the Messiah come again. How can you, there had been build up Germany and its society, liberal theology encroaching and coming in, making the truths of Scripture more relative and subjective and allegorizing everything. all of that would have had an impact. But by God's grace, there were people who resisted, and there were people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and so many others. I believe the organization in English called the White Rose, which were very much against. So at the point of time in which this Kursk battle is happening, Hitler's mind is going to be all over the place. It's going to be, it was spread so thin. And as I already said, evil overextends itself, and as such will always fail. And by God's grace, we see that with the failure to conquer Kursk, with his delays and with the pride that was associated with all of his decision making, that was the last opportunity that Nazi Germany would have.
So in conclusion, and summing up the Battle of the Kursk that happened around this time 80 years ago, the German army was never able to threaten Moscow again. After this battle, the Russians had seized the initiative and did not relent until they reached Berlin in 1945. The Soviets won the Battle of Kursk, ended Hitler's dream of conquering Russia. Arguably, Germany won the tactical battle, but was unable to break through the Red Army's fortifications and so lost the advantage. And so therefore, I think it's also important and imperative that we reflect on the Battle of Kursk 80 years ago. Firstly, for the incredible loss of life, fierce fighting. We don't know how many people are actually injured, but it would have been hundreds of thousands of people actually injured as well in this battle. And this probably described as probably the bloodiest battle in the history of humanity as well. There's certainly the largest tank battle in history that we saw as well. So kind of reflecting 80 years on, we have to understand that God is in charge of history, and that history is his story. We see that the Battle of Kursk plays a major role in the psyche of Russia and the Russian people, as well as bringing humiliation and shame upon Hitler himself.
Yeah, around 1 million soldiers believed to have lost their lives in this one battle alone. So it's right that we remember it, Simon. It's right that we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Kursk. It's right that we recognize God's sovereignty in and through all of these events. And so I'm thankful to have had this program with you. Thankful to our viewers for joining us for this edition of Behind the Headlines. God willing, we'll see you again next week.